really understand it, obviously we have to go back to the American Revolution. So against all odds, the American revolutionaries defeated the greatest military on the earth. They faced a question at that point. What sort of government are we going to set up? Is it going to be a monarchy? Well, the monarchies had had a pretty good track record up to that point. There had been good kings who had ruled in the interest of all the people, and there had also been bad kings who had ruled in their own self-interest or in the interest of their own tribes or clans. Now, Aristotle said that a good ruler rules for all the people and not just for themselves or for their own self-interest or the self-interest of their own group, but for all the people. So were we going to have a monarchy or were we going to have a republic? Now, republics had an awful track record up to that point. The history of republics was one of failure. Going all the way back to the ancient period, these ancient city-states had established republics, and they had always failed. They had always started out with high hopes and good intentions, but they had always devolved down into tyranny. That's what our founding fathers knew. In the 10th Federalist Papers, James Madison reflected on why republics had always failed, and he concluded that it was because of factions. The factions had always developed and caused the collapse, so certain groups had favored their own self-interest rather than the common good. But the big problem is that republics throughout history didn't just collapse into a benign monarchy. They collapsed into absolute tyranny. So it was a huge gamble to choose to go with a republic as opposed to a monarchy. I mean, at the time that we won the Revolutionary War, we had a really good candidate for a monarchy. In fact, the perfect candidate. One who had anti-tyrannical views, one who had already been offered power several times and declined it, one who had a reputation of being fair and bipartisan, nonpartisan, a candidate who everyone liked. So it wasn't necessarily an easy choice because everyone looked up to George Washington. Turning back to the Federalist Papers, the very first paragraph of the very first Federalist paper, Alexander Hamilton said, and talking about sort of the importance of what they were doing, that it seems to have been reserved to the people of our country at that time by their conduct and example to decide the important question of whether societies of men were really capable or not to decide good government by reflection or choice, or whether people are forever destined to depend on accident and force and the rule of government. So the founders knew that they were designing this new Constitution, that they were making a choice. It wasn't just an organic development. It was something that they were choosing to do and to design in such a way that it would preserve our liberties and that would avoid the possibility of tyranny. The revolution we had just fought was about tyranny. George III had become tyrannical. It was tyranny that defined the American Revolution. So now that we've defeated King George III, are we going to replace King George III with another potential tyrant? Are we going to replace King George III with a better King George, King George Washington? Or shall we opt for a republic despite the awful track record of failures in the past for republics? It wasn't an easy choice. They rolled the dice. They opted for a republic, not a democracy, mind you. Democracy, the word democracy had a negative connotation to our founding fathers at that time. The Federalist Papers talks about democracies as being mob rule, essentially. A republic, on the other hand, is self-government. The people participating in government themselves, like democracy, but also in ways that ensure that civil rights and liberties are protected, unlike mob rule, unlike pure democracy. So what is a republic? Here, really, we can fast forward to a man who was always a staunch defender of the American founding, and that was Abraham Lincoln. remember, and he was often quoting the Declaration of Independence his entire life. Remember, at the Gettysburg Address, he dedicated that battlefield, saying, quote, "With God's help, this nation will undergo a rebirth of freedom and government for the people, by the people, and of the people, shall not perish from the earth." So all government is of the people, but a good government is for the people. The difference with a republic is that government is also by the people. So it was an experiment, and experiments can by definition fail. In the past, they have failed. They collapsed into tyranny. Abraham Lincoln recognized that our Republican experiment could fail, that it is an experiment. The Civil War was testing whether that experiment would fail, not only from the ground that we're standing on in the United States, but also over the entire earth. Over the entire earth. Lincoln recognized that this experiment was really the final experiment in republicanism for all time over the entire earth. Because it would depend about whether, if it wouldn't work, if it would not work in America, if it failed here, that would prove to the entire world that Republican government is just not possible, it's not sustainable. That we just can't have government by the people. It won't work, it will always devolve into tyranny, it will degenerate. People will realize that they're just not capable of governing themselves, that they have to be governed, one would hope, by some nice or benign authoritarian ruler. And history has shown that some have been good, but when you have a bad one, you have a really bad one. So Lincoln knew that it wasn't just our republic here in the United States that was at risk. So he fought the war really for the same reason that our original founding fathers had fought the American Revolutionary War. But why had republics failed? Why was it a roll of the dice? Today we use the word democracy ever since the era of Woodrow Wilson. And today everyone seems to like democracy. You'll hear Joe Biden talking about democracy. Everybody talks about threats to our democracy. Well, even tyrants claim to be interested in democracy. For instance, Communist China, the People's Republic of China. Why does it fail? Madison said that it has something to do, talking about Republican government. James Madison said it has something to do with tribalism. Tribalism, narrow self-interest. We end up squabbling and nobody looks out for the public good. In Federalist number 10, Madison wrote how the Constitution should be adopted because it can remedy those defects of tribalism and factionalism rather than people acting for the common good. So why did obviously first we had the Articles of Confederation, but why did we end up with a Constitution that was ratified? Well, it's because it was designed in such a way as to prevent tyranny and to protect liberty. Now, Professor George gave this example when I heard him speak. He said, my students at Princeton are among the brightest in the country, and I always ask them this question: how was our Constitution designed by our founders in such a way as to prevent tyranny and protect liberty? And without fail, they'll always answer that, well, we have this Bill of Rights. It gives us the right of free speech, the right of assembly, freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms, and then we have the judiciary, which will enforce those rights. Without fail, they'll say that. But that's exactly the wrong answer. And no doubt they'll have heard it from their high school history teachers. They'll have heard it in popular culture. They'll have heard it from their history professors. They'll have heard it from the media. But that's absolutely the wrong answer. That wasn't the design. Yes, we have a Bill of Rights, and that's important. Those were added as amendments shortly after the Constitution was ratified. And it's true that we have an independent judiciary. And at least since 1803, has been able to review the constitutionality of the actions of the other branches of government. But that's not the right answer. So what is the right answer? Well, the right answer how the Constitution protects us and prevents tyranny and protects liberty is by limited governmental power, particularly at the national level, the central government. To do this, our founders came up with really a revolutionary new political idea. And it was an idea of dividing sovereignty, establishing, yes, a national federal government, but that federal government was not given all of the power. It was given specifically delegated and enumerated powers, and therefore limited powers. So the federal government, under our Constitution, may only legitimately exercise those powers that have been delegated to it by our Constitution. Even if it would be good for the federal government to exercise more power, no, that's not the design that we have. They may not do it. That's a dramatic difference from the way it is in Europe and the way it had been in Europe. Those, France, England, all of those governments are centralized powers, while plenary power, general power resides in the central government. While there may be states or provinces or counties or political subdivisions in those European countries, they have no sovereignty. They're all sub-creatures of the central government there. So the parliament, for instance, could always retract any powers it gives to those subdivisions. So the government that's furthest away from the people, the central government, retains all the power, even if there are political subdivisions. That's the way it is in England and France. And the founders of our country didn't want the government that was furthest away from the people to have plenary power. They wanted a federal government to have some powers, but they wanted those to be limited. Now, the states, by contrast, in the United States, they have that plenary power. They have the general power, the police powers, and it's a federal government that is limited. So here, the powers of the state government are not derivative. The powers of West Virginia are not derivative from Washington, D.C. They didn't give us our power, they can't take it away. That's the way our Constitution was set up. The states have general jurisdiction and police powers, subject only to limitations placed on them by the Constitution and by the delegation of powers that are given to the federal government. And that is the concept of federalism. And that federalism is dividing power so that nobody has too much power, that nobody has unchecked power. Now, even within the federal government, that's divided so that nobody has too much power there. And that's called separation of powers. Separation of powers between the branches. So Article 1 of the Constitution delegates all legislative authority to Congress. Article 2 vests all executive authority into the President of the United States. And Article 3 deals with the judiciary. And now to appoint judges, by design, the President gets to pick, but Congress has to approve. So then the first two branches share the appointment power for the third. And then once federal judges are appointed, Article 3 judges, they serve for life. So that was the design of separating power. So the key to protecting liberty and preventing tyranny is avoiding unchecked power, the accumulation of power in any one branch, person, or group of people. So it's clear that the main work of protecting our liberty is just in the basic structure of how our government is created, divided, and in such a way as to limit and separate power. Antonin Scalia used to talk about how great the Constitution of the Soviet Union was. If you read the words, it was great. There were all sorts of protections in the Soviet Constitution. But you know what? Obviously, it was meaningless. It was just a bunch of words written on paper. So our founding fathers knew that it meant nothing just to write something down on a piece of parchment. That meant absolutely nothing, because government's going to do what government's going to do. And who's going to stop them? The American experiment, in fact, has worked, and not because of the Bill of Rights or the judiciary, which sometimes has done good things and sometimes has done really bad things. For instance, the Korematsu case, where the Supreme Court said that it was absolutely legal to put Japanese American citizens in concentration camps. That's still good law under the United States. We've had awful decisions about involuntary sterilization of people. I mean, there have been good decisions and bad decisions from our judiciary, from our Supreme Court. The reason we've survived as far as we have is because of the structure of federalism, with states having sovereign powers, the federal government being limited, and then within the federal government separating those powers. And we have the same structure with our state government in West Virginia. If you read our West Virginia Constitution, it's not very long. Unlike the federal Constitution, our West Virginia Constitution actually has an express provision requiring separation of powers. So it's presumed really just in the structure in the federal Constitution, but our state Constitution requires it. Not that we're following it all the past year and a half, but I urge you to read it. It talks about separation of powers. The fact is that since this was set up, it's eroded over time. It needs to be revitalized. The national government, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, has become extremely powerful, very, very powerful. It's become far more powerful than anything our founding generation ever would have visualized. We need a revitalization of federalism, as well as separation of powers. The most neglected word of our Constitution is the very first word of the very first sentence of the very first paragraph of the very first article, and that is the word all. All legislative authority shall be vested in the legislature. That word doesn't appear in any of the other articles. And it doesn't say a lot. It doesn't say some. It says all legislative power. And we can look and see what's going on in Washington, D.C., not just today, but in the past decades. Is all legislative power being exercised by Congress right now in Washington, D.C.? No. In fact, we could say that very little legislative power is being exercised by Congress. It's all mostly being exercised by the executive branch, by the president, and by these endless bureaucracies in Washington, D.C. And everything I'm saying is also really reflected in state governments, especially in West Virginia, where you have these huge bureaucracies. Do we, if as a small business owner, if we look at all the rules that we have to follow, can we really blame Joe Manchin or Alex Mooney for all of these rules that we have to follow, all the hoops we have to jump through? No, they didn't really have anything to do with it. All this stuff was done in the bowels of the federal bureaucracy. And it's been happening that way for a long time. Congress, over the years, has abdicated its power to the executive branch, abdicated its power to the presidents, and the presidents have grabbed that power. Presidents of both parties have grabbed that power. They've consistently overstepped their authority and taken legislative power in violation of the Constitution. And the judicial branch has done it as well, legislating from the bench. But Congress itself can't be let off the hook. Just because Congress wants to give away its power, they can't do it. Just like the West Virginia legislature wants to give away its power to the governor, just because they don't act or want to give their power away, they're not allowed to do it. In fact, there's a West Virginia Supreme Court case that says that the West Virginia legislature is not allowed to delegate its legislative ability to the governor. Same thing for Congress. Just because the legislature doesn't fix some problem doesn't mean the governor gets to come and swoop in and solve the problem and say, well, the legislature didn't do anything, or they're too scared to meet, or whatever. No. All legislative power resides in the legislature. For instance, immigration. All right. Congress doesn't want to deal with it. They want to let the president deal with it. And in fact, during the Obama administration, he at first said, "Look, I'm the executive branch. I can't deal with immigration." And then what does he do by the end of his presidency? He does deal with immigration through executive order. So far too often, difficult or controversial issues such as immigration, where Congress doesn't want to deal with it, they've let the presidency deal with it. And it's always a slippery slope after that. But it's never okay to say that because Congress didn't act, the executive has to act. That doesn't justify the executive violating Article 1. So our Constitution it needs to be revitalized. It's the structure itself that is important. Again, it's not specifically what the Bill of Rights say. It's not what the judiciary interprets them to say. The fact is I think most of us here probably consider ourselves conservatives, and conservatives have to conserve something. So what are we conserving? What is worth conserving? I think that is the Republican form of government, that all men are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, a national government with delegated powers, and states with general jurisdiction. It's worth conserving separation of powers. Let's bring it back. Let's revitalize it. Now, the word liberal, it's been used where it shouldn't be used. Conservatives should also, in protecting the Constitution, be classically liberal. So liberal stands for liberty, civil liberty, freedom of speech. Right now, they're under assault. Look at cancel culture, people being punished for exercising their constitutional rights of freedom, their constitutionally protected speech. We should be liberal in embracing civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, due process of law, equal protection. That kind of liberalism is protecting the weak and the unborn child. That's what equal protection is all about. We should be solid as a rock in affirming the concept of American exceptionalism. Right now it's under attack. And it doesn't mean that Americans are any better than anyone else. That's not what it means. It means that we're a nation. The USA is a nation that, unlike other nations around the world, we're not organized around blood or soil. We're not organized around just merely culture or religion. We have those things. We have many different types of religions here. We have many different types of cultures. We have many different ethnicities and race. So how are we united? We are united in what makes us exceptional is that we're united around the principles in our founding documents, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence. We're united because it means that somebody who's willing to come here and work hard, embrace our principles, anyone can become an American. So anyone coming from India or even China, embracing our principles, can be as an American as somebody whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. And you'd have a much bigger task ahead of you trying to become Japanese, for instance. So that is what unites us as Americans. Many Americans who came here maybe couldn't even speak the same language, spoke poor English, maybe couldn't read English, but they were still Americans because they believed it. They were willing to shed their blood to defend it. Generations of immigrants fought to preserve the Republic of America, and that's exceptional. That's not a myth. Let's not give it up. We're not united by blood or by soil or culture or religion. We're united because we have a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And as Abraham Lincoln warned, we shall not let it perish from the earth. Thanks, and I'll